All right, guys, so in this video, we're going to be finishing up lesson 4.8. So we're going to be looking at the last few examples from the notes, starting with example number 12 on page 5. So we have this function, this tangent function, g of x. And in the first part, we want to figure out the domain and the range of g. So let's first start by thinking about the domain and range of the parent function for tangent. So we know that tangent has vertical asymptotes at negative pi over 2 and at pi over 2. And tangent looks like a cubic. So its domain is going to be everywhere where we don't have the vertical asymptotes. So it's going to be all the x values that are not the asymptotes. So our first asymptote starts at pi over 2. That's the first positive asymptote. And then since we know that the period of tangent is pi, we know that the asymptotes are pi units apart. So it's going to be plus n pi, where n is an integer. That's going to be the domain for the parent function. And we know the range of tangent is just going to be all real numbers, so negative infinity to positive infinity. So we want the domain and range of g. So we notice here that g has some transformations. So we have this x minus 3 pi over 2, which we know is going to translate the parent function to the right 3 pi over 2. So since that affects the x values, that will affect the domain. And then we have this plus 4, which will translate the parent function 4 units up. And that usually affects the range. But let's first start with domain. So we want the domain of g. And domain, we have a right shift 3 pi over 2. So that's going to take my parent function and shift the asymptotes over 3 pi over 2. So this first asymptote of negative pi over 2 is going to be just shifted over 3 pi over 2. So what does that correspond to? That corresponds to us basically adding 3 pi over 2 to the asymptotes. So I'm going to say negative pi over 2, that first asymptote. I'm going to add 3 pi over 2. And that gives me 2 pi over 2 or pi. So that's going to be where my first asymptote starts for g of x. And since we know that the asymptotes are pi units apart, since the period is still pi, we can say that the domain for g is going to be x not equal to pi plus n pi, where n is an integer. Now the range of g, the plus 4, even though it's a vertical shift, is not going to affect the range since the range is all real numbers. So the range for g is going to still be all real numbers. So that's my domain and range of g. All right, so now in part B, we want to find the inverse function g inverse. So we know that to find inverse functions, we have to do two things. We need to swap x and y, and then solve for y. So what is y? Well, y is just g of x, right? It's the same thing as y. So y is our function tangent of x minus 3 pi over 2 plus 4. So the first thing we're going to do is swap x and y. So I'm going to now say x equals the tangent of y minus 3 pi over 2 plus 4. So now we need to solve for y. So I need to move this 4 by subtracting it. X minus 4 equals the tangent of y minus 3 pi over 2. So now I need to still solve for y. So I need to get this y isolated. So I need to undo tangent. And to undo tangent, I take the tangent inverse of both sides. So this is going to give me tangent inverse of x minus 4 equals y minus 3 pi over 2. And remember, you can also use arctangent for tangent inverse as well. All right, so the last thing we have to do now is just add this 3 pi over 2 to both sides to isolate y. So I have tangent inverse of x minus 4 plus 3 pi over 2 equals y. And just for good measure, let's just go ahead and rewrite y as g inverse. So g inverse of x equals the tangent inverse of x minus 4 plus 3 pi over 2. So that is my inverse function. All right, now the last part here, we're going to find the domain and range for G inverse. So if we know about the relationship between the domain and range for inverse functions, we know that the domain of G of X is going to be just the range of G inverse, and the range of G of X is going to be the domain of G inverse. All right. So if I want the domain of G inverse, I need to figure out what's the range of G. So the domain of G inverse is the range of G. What's the range of G? The range of G was just all real numbers. So that would be my domain of G inverse. Inverse is going to be the domain of G. But remember, we have to restrict the domain for inverse trig functions. So for tangent, we had to restrict the domain to negative pi over 2 to pi over 2 so that we could define the inverse. So we need to restrict this domain for G in order for us to define the inverse. So we need to think about what is the restricted domain of G. Well, all we need is just one period. So since we know that for G, the domain starts at pi, its period is pi, so it'll end at 2 pi. So the restricted domain for G is going to be pi to 2 pi. So that will give us the range of G inverse. So then the range of G inverse is going to be also pi to 2 pi.